guys, today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite shows on the CW, Reign. Reign is a historical drama about Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth during the 16th century. But before you go and write your history paper based on the TV show, we're going to be comparing the TV show to actual history. Now this video today is going to have a lot of spoilers, so be sure to watch the show before watching this video. This is about talking about everything that's happened in the show since it is over now. Mary, Queen of Scotland was born in 1542, and she was crowned Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old because her father was on his deathbed at the time of her birth. Throughout the show, one of the biggest storylines is Mary's claim to the English throne, but I don't think it's very well explained why she has a claim to the English throne according to, her birthright. So it is historically accurate that she did have a claim to the English throne. Now in England, the crown passes down to the first male heir, and if there isn't a male heir, then it passes to the female, or if the male heir dies without having another heir, then the crown will pass to the female that was related to him, a sister or something like that. So Henry VIII, the guy who's known for beheading all of his wives, he was the ruler of England, while his older sister, Margaret Tudor, was actually married to James IV, who was King of Scotland. So Margaret and James were King and Queen of Scotland. Margaret and James had a son who was James V, and he was the father of Mary. Now when Henry VIII died, he had only one male heir, and that was Edward. So Edward became king, however he died very young at the age of 15 and did not leave any male heirs, or any heirs at all for that matter. Henry VIII did also leave two other children, Mary and Elizabeth. So based on this, the crown should go back to Mary. However, Edward actually named somebody as his successor, and he named Jane Grey as his successor. So she became Queen of England, but only for a couple of days. She was queen for about 9 days, and then Mary marched on the capital with, all of her supporters and captured Jane, had her beheaded, and then Mary became Queen of England. So she became Queen of England, and she is known as Bloody Mary, but she did die without leaving any heirs. So then the crown went to her sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I is known as one of England's greatest monarchs of all time. Now let's talk about why some people might not have seen these two women as the rightful rulers of England. So during that time, they did not have support of the people that were Catholic. During that time, a ruler had to be married by the Catholic Church. The church had to recognize that marriage, and then once that marriage was recognized, then they had children, and those children were recognized as legitimate children because the marriage was recognized as a legitimate marriage by the church. However, if you got married to somebody who the church did not recognize, if your marriage was not recognized by the church, then your children were considered bastards because they didn't come from a legit marriage, basically. So because Henry VIII had, his first child, Mary, with his first wife, and then, got rid of her and had these other wives and these other children, they weren't recognized by the Catholic Church, and so all the children were considered bastards. He did have his first marriage annulled and then killed, the mothers of his other children. So all of those children were considered bastards and therefore were not considered real heirs to the throne. By Catholics, of course. So even though Henry VIII had these other children, people thought that the rightful heir was the legitimate child. So since none of those children were legitimate, the crown therefore went back to his older sister and down her line, which would have been to Mary, who was the surviving heir of that line. So there were people on both sides of this supporting each queen for their own agenda. Now, this was really more a political game. A game about power and less about religion. Now, I brought up Jane Grey because it's really important to realize that being a monarch did not guarantee your safety, and Jane Grey represents the real threat that Queen Elizabeth was very afraid of. It was a real possibility that somebody who supported someone else as the rightful monarch could come and overtake her and kill her. So while some people think that Elizabeth was cruel by having Mary beheaded, Mary did pose a real threat to Elizabeth. Now, I don't think it was mentioned in the show that Mary, Queen of Scots, actually was supposed to be engaged to Edward, King Henry VIII's son, and that did not work out because there were, people pushing different agendas, whereas people wanted her to stay Catholic, and, Henry VIII's heir Edward was going to be raised Protestant, and they wanted Scotland to stay Catholic, so they wanted Mary to marry another person, another ruler that was Catholic instead of going with the Protestant church. So because of that, that didn't work out, and who knows how that might have changed, how that would have made history different. And then again, she might have just ended up dying quicker because Edward did die at a very young age of 15, without being able to leave any heirs. But who knows how that might have changed Outlander, which I hated that show, but that, took place many years after this, and who knows how that might have all affected it. But they wanted her to marry a Catholic ruler. So Mary de Guise, her mother, arranged a marriage with Francis over in France and had her taken over there for her protection because she was in danger. So the first part of the show of opening up where she's in France and they're trying to protect her because there are a lot of threats on her life, that is all accurate. In the show, we have Mary's 4 friends sent with her from Scotland to France, and those are her ladies in waiting. This is accurate, but their names were not Lola, Gria, Ailey, and Kenna. All of them were named Mary, but you can definitely understand why they changed their names because how annoying would it have been to have 5 people in the show named Mary, or 7 if you want to count Mary's mother and the current monarch of England, Bloody Mary. They were sent over with one of the girls' mothers, and it was her that had the affair with Henry and not Kenna. All 4 of them returned with her to Scotland after Frances died. 3 of them were married afterwards, and 1 stayed with her for the rest of her life. Let's talk about Mary's first mother and father-in-law. Right away in the show, we see King Henry II of France with his mistress Diane. This is historically accurate. He did not have a good marriage with Catherine de Medici, and Diane was his longtime mistress, and it was common knowledge to everyone and accepted, as weird as that sounds. But not shown in the TV show is that Diane was actually 20 years older than Henry, so she was a cougar. Henry II was crowned king after his brother's death, and he wanted control over England, and he used Mary to try to do that. And he definitely played a big part in Mary's unsuccessful attempts for the English throne. Henry did have 3 other children that were not with Diane or with Catherine de Medici. However, he did not have any children with Diane, so Sebastian in the show did not exist. And when you thought the show was really just trying to go for drama and King Henry is killed in this big jousting match, actually that is historically accurate. King Henry II of France was killed in a jousting match. You would think that somebody who's, the King of France would not be participating in such dangerous games, but that is actually how he died. However, it was probably not his son that was the other writer. Catherine de Medici and Henry II actually did have quite a few children, which we don't really see much of in the TV show. We do see some of her kids, but she actually had quite a few more that we don't really see too much of. Now, it actually did take them 10 years to start having children, which was very hard on Catherine because it was expected, for you to produce an heir if you were the king's wife and to produce them very quickly. But they were children when they got married. They were about 14. So she was about 24 when she started having children. So she wasn't an old person when she did start having her children. So they did have 10 children, which is a lot for monarchs back then. Francis, who became King of France, Elizabeth, who was Queen of Spain, Claude, who did marry a duke, Louis, who died as a child, Charles, who became King of France, Henry, who became King of France, and Margaret, who became Queen of France, Hercules, a duke, and Victoria, who died as a child, and Joan, a stillborn. So it is mentioned during the show that Catherine does have the 2 twins. However, it doesn't seem like they were twins. It seems like they were a little bit apart, but it was 2 girls that did die very early. Nostradamus was someone who did influence Catherine, but he was an old man during the time the show takes place. And many people do believe in his visions, but that's a whole other topic. It is historically accurate that Catherine de' Medici did not have a good relationship with Mary. However, it does seem that later on they did get along quite well.
They tried to diminish a king tonight by degrading a queen, and they will not. Trust me and let me help you.
Francis was Mary's first husband, and they did rule France for a short period of time. He did die from an ear infection. He was seen as a frail and sickly person, however, they were children during this time.
There are rumors about all royals. You know what they say about you? Half of Europe thinks that you're sickly and weak and stunted.
That half-blind portrait artist didn't realize I was sitting in a chair while my sister was standing, and now half of Europe thinks I'm a dwarf.
He did not have any children during his life, but it is believed that he and Mary were quite happy together. And as for marriages, it was very common for the marriages of royals to be consummated in front of other people. So basically, a bunch of old gross men watching kids do it for the first time. Totally creepy and pervy. Prince Condé was a real person and was a rival to Francis for the throne. So Mary did know him, but they probably didn't have an affair together, and he was 12 years older than her, so about 13 years older than Francis. James Earl of Moray was a real person and was Mary's half-brother. But he actually died 3 years after Mary was taken prisoner, so he did not raise her child, he only cared for him for a short period of time. John Knox was a real person, and I would say it was historically accurate as far as the show went portraying him. He was a religious fanatic and he did hate women. Unfortunately, in real life, he lived a very long life, died in old age. But it just seems common that bad people are given so much more time. Maybe they need it.
The only crime I have committed that you care about is that I am a woman. A woman who wears a crown.
A woman in power goes against nature itself. Men will never willingly bow to the weaker sex.
Robert Dudley was a real person and is very famous for being the lover of Queen Elizabeth, who never married. They were friends since they were children, and they were both imprisoned by Bloody Mary. He was married to Amy Dudley. However, when Elizabeth did take the crown, she gave Robert Dudley titles and money that kept him close to her at court. However, because of all of this, he was the most unpopular man in England. And if it wasn't for that, they might have actually been able to get married. Now, it is true that Amy Dudley was found dead at the stairs in their home. However, historians now believe that it might have been a different cause than what they actually assumed back then. They believe she might have had breast cancer and just been very frail and weak and then fell to her death. And at that time, people wouldn't have understood that, so they did blame Robert Dudley. He was seen as being guilty. And because of that, him and Elizabeth were just never able to be married. So the events in the show may have been a little bit exaggerated. The timeline doesn't fit exactly, but the major events are historically accurate. Lord Darnley Henry Stuart was a real person and accurately portrayed in Reign. He was Mary's second husband, and he was not a very good man to her. He was in line for the English throne, and he was also very handsome and charming, according to people of the time. But he was also very disliked by many people for being very selfish and arrogant and rude. He did turn out to be one of the worst decisions in Mary's life. He was very cruel, very argumentative with her. He wanted the crown matrimonial from her, just as portrayed in the show, and she refused to give it to him. And he did participate in having her secretary, Rizzio, murdered in front of her. And yet somehow in the show, he's one of the characters I actually felt really bad for. So let me know in the comments down below how you felt about him. And then for Mary's marriage to Lord Darnley, Catherine did not actually attend that. So that was not historically accurate. She was actually not able to go over from France to Scotland for that marriage. Lord Bothwell was a real person, and all we know for certain is that he was Mary's third husband. Now, what we don't know is if, those two were in love and if he did kill Lord Darnley. It is a huge debate among historians if Bothwell helped Mary kill her second husband. For some accounts, he rapes Mary and forces her into marriage after her husband's death. And in other accounts, it seems that those two were lovers before and then had him killed and then covered it up. But there is no evidence to actually say whether or not they did do it. Now, it is pretty easy to believe that Mary would have wanted her husband killed because of how awful he was, but there just isn't any proof as to what really happened. David Rizzio was Mary's secretary and her trusted friend, and he was killed in front of her when she was pregnant. He was stabbed 47 times in front of her when he died. Gideon Blackburn, the guy with all the game that had both queens in love with him, did not exist. But Mary was considered very beautiful for the time, so it is historically accurate that she probably did have a lot of people falling in love with her. Lord Narcisse did not exist in real life, unfortunately, for all of his fans out there. In Reign, they were all teenagers in the show, but to put some things in real perspective, Mary was actually 15 when she was married to Francis, who was 14. She was left a widow at the age of 17, and then she married Lord Darnley at the age of 22. She was taken prisoner by Elizabeth at the age of 25 and was killed at the age of 44. Elizabeth became queen when she was 25, and she lived a long life and died when she was 69. Elizabeth and Mary never actually met face to face. However, Elizabeth did recognize James, Mary's son, as her heir, and he did become the king to both Scotland and England. And from there you get into all the historical events that led down to Outlander. I did really enjoy Reign over the last few years, but I did feel that season 4 was really rushed. I don't think that we needed quite so much of, 3 seasons of Mary over in France and then a few episodes of her in Scotland. I think at the end we definitely could have done without all of the stuff going on at the French court, because we wanted to see more of Mary in Scotland and see the events that happened. Everything was very rushed, cramped together, and we didn't even get to fully see everything that would have happened in Mary's life when she was living in Scotland as Queen of Scotland. I know many people were confused by Princess Margaret showing up at French court, at the end of the series, and that was because the Valois males in the family were not going to have too good of a future. They're all going to be dying, and therefore weren't going to continue that line. And the crown was actually going to pass, from the Valois family to another family, and Margaret is going to, in the future, marry into that family. And that's how she becomes Queen of France. It isn't from getting the crown passed down through from her family, it's her actually marrying over into the next line. And that's why Catherine is now, focused on that child, because she's the one that's going to rule France in the future. Claude's failed marriage to Luke was a pretty big disappointment. I think we all wanted to see Claude happy, and it would have been better to see Claude really happy and then maybe later die in childbirth, how it really did happen in real life, but at least to get Claude happy. And it was so frustrating to see Mary willing to have an affair when her husband truly loved her, and then refusing to have an affair when her husband was awful to her. And we didn't even get to see anything with Mary and Bothwell. I mean, they did end up getting married. They were in love with each other, at least in the show, but even in real life, they did end up getting married, and we didn't even get to see that. There was just no closure when it came to the relationship of Mary with Bothwell. However, Mary's reuniting with Francis at the very end was pretty perfect. Now, the Spanish Armada did not attack England before Mary was taken prisoner. It is historically accurate that the Spanish Armada did, attack England, and they were defeated, mostly because of the English Channel, but that didn't take place till way after. It wasn't before Mary was taken prisoner. It was actually when Mary was killed by Elizabeth, and this was like the last little bit of an excuse that Spain needed to attack England. They had been waiting and just, wanting to start a war with them between those two countries, but once Mary was killed, they were actually able to go and attack them. That was their excuse. And it was because they were a Catholic nation. They recognized Mary as a Catholic monarch, and when she was killed, they had to retaliate, do something. But it also kind of makes you think, well, she was prisoner for how long? Over 20 years? Don't you think you could have attacked when she was taken prisoner, and then maybe, the point was to free her? But again, it was their excuse. They just needed the excuse to go and attack England. So that didn't happen till very much later. Pretty much all of the clothing in Reign is anything but historically accurate. but I loved it. It was just so much better than the real thing. In episode 1 of season 1, we see Mary given a black rosary when she's leaving the convent. And that is the black rosary that she is carrying when she is beheaded in the very last episode of Reign. Overall, the story of these monarchs during the 1500s is very dramatic, so you can see why it makes for a pretty good TV show. And they did really follow major events that happened through history. And as for the rest, who knows but them what really happened. Thanks for watching, and if you like it, subscribe.